We, here at Past the Pumpkin's Glow, just want to say thank you for all the new subscribers and those that have been hanging out with us this entire time. New or old, we really appreciate it. Before we dive into today's eerie adventure, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any of our haunting stories. Growing up, my grandmother lived with us after her husband passed away. My dad suggested moving her in, and this took place a year before I was born. She was like a second mom to me. Fast forward to 1998-99, my dad was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. The family stayed positive, with my grandma being a rock for my mom. Years passed, and by the mid-2000s, the cancer worsened despite treatments. I was on the brink of moving out, working to afford my own place. My siblings had long moved out. One had a family, and the other was focused on a career. They came home as often as possible, which breathed new life into the house. Still in the mid-2000s, my dad passed away. The same year, my grandma had been bleeding internally, but hid it to avoid worrying the family. She collapsed from weakness and fatigue, and we moved her into hospice after discovering her stomach cancer was terminal. Within a couple of months, she passed away. During this period, my mom and I tried to distract ourselves by watching movies in the living room. One night, while watching a movie, we both noticed a shadow moving silently through the dining room. It was tall, moved quietly, and headed towards the hallway where my grandma's and dad's rooms had been. We exchanged glances, and I got up to follow the shadow, but it was gone. My mom sat in her chair, praying, convinced it was something dark. I never saw the shadow again, but my mother said she saw it more after that night. For me, the horrors later moved to my dreams. I had been involved in some paranormal investigations with my coworkers, exploring various locations rumored to be haunted. One such place was an old, white, two-story farmhouse with a green roof and shutters, and an exterior storm cellar entrance on the side of the house. This house became the setting for a recurring nightmare. In the nightmare, I enter the storm cellar. The concrete floor is cold, and I see a set of stone stairs leading up to what I can see through the cracked door is the kitchen. To the right, a tunnel extends into darkness, illuminated by a single strand of globe string lights. Despite the eerie ambiance, I feel an inexplicable pull towards the tunnel and begin walking. I walk for what feels like an eternity, far beyond the reach of the home. Eventually, I take a left turn, leading me to another long stretch of tunnel. Near the corner where I turned, there is a cutout in the wall, housing a large, dark stone well. I lean over the edge and call down, but all I hear are whispers, too faint to understand no matter how hard I strain or beg them to yell. My nightmare matched reality. I suddenly remember I had an amplifier and a microphone in my car. I run back to my car, grab the gear, and return to the well. Somehow, despite not finding a power outlet, the amp is on and I lower the mic into the well. This time, instead of whispers, I hear screams. First, it's my dad and grandma, then others I don't recognize. They're pleading for help. I pull the mic back up, panicked and unsure of how to help. That's where the nightmare always ends, out of reach and nothing I can do. Thanks for listening. When I took the job at the old post office in our small town, I thought it would be a quiet, easy job. The building itself was a relic from the early 1900s, with its original wooden floors and high ceilings. It had an air of nostalgia, a place where time seemed to stand still. Little did I know that something else had stood still there too, something dark and malevolent. From the very first day, I felt uneasy. It was subtle at first, a sense that I was never quite alone. I would hear soft creaks and groans from the old wood, as if someone were moving around just out of sight. But it was an old building after all, and I dismissed these sounds as part of its charm. My job was straightforward: sort the mail, assist customers, and make sure everything was locked up at the end of the day. The first few weeks passed without incident, but then things began to change. It started with small things: letters misplaced, drawers left open, lights flickering. I blamed it on my own forgetfulness, but the incidents grew more unsettling. One evening, as I was closing up, I heard footsteps echoing through the empty hall. I called out, but no one answered. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. I searched the building, but it was empty. I could feel a presence, though, something watching me, relishing my fear. The entity showed itself in different ways. Sometimes it was a shadow moving swiftly along the walls, other times a faint, ghostly figure lingering at the edge of my vision. Once, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness of the back room. The forms it took were never the same, but the terror they invoked was consistent. It wasn't just at work. The entity followed me home, invading my dreams. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, after nightmares of being chased through the endless corridors of the post office. The dream would always end the same way. I'd be cornered, unable to escape, and the entity would reveal its true, horrifying form, a shifting mass of darkness and malice. I began to dread going to work. The post office, once a quaint and peaceful place, had become a house of horrors. I tried to explain what was happening to my friends and family, but they looked at me with pity and concern, not understanding. They thought I was overworked or stressed. Maybe I was going insane. One night I decided to confront the entity. I stayed late, long after closing, and sat in the dimly lit office, waiting. The air grew cold, and the familiar sense of dread settled over me. The lights flickered and the shadows seemed to deepen, coalescing into a figure in the corner of the room. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved closer, shifting and changing as it approached. Faces appeared and disappeared in the darkness, twisted, tormented faces that seemed to be crying out in agony. The air grew thick and a low, guttural laugh echoed through the room. The entity reveled in my fear, feeding off it. I felt my sanity slipping, the line between reality and nightmare blurring. Desperation took hold, and I lashed out, throwing the nearest object, a heavy book, at the figure. It passed through the entity, hitting the wall with a thud, and the laughter grew louder, more mocking. I fled the post office, leaving it in darkness. That night, my dreams were worse than ever. The entity knew it had won. It haunted my every waking moment, my every nightmare. I could see it in the shadows of my room, hear it whispering just beyond my hearing. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't take it anymore. As I walked away from the post office for the last time, I felt a strange mix of relief and terror. I had escaped, but the entity was still there, lurking in the old building, waiting for its next victim. To this day, I can't pass by the post office without a sense of unease. I hear rumors from the new employees, whispers of strange occurrences, of an uneasy feeling in the air. I know the entity is still there, enjoying its reign of terror. And sometimes late at night, I still see it in my dreams, reminding me that I will never truly be free from the horror that haunted me in that old post office. When my wife and I moved into our new home, our son Alex was just 3 years old. Almost immediately, he began talking about his friend, Charlie, who he said lived in his closet. At first, we thought it was just a phase, a common imaginary friend. But then, strange things started happening around the house, particularly around Alex's room. Each night, we would hear the soft murmur of conversations coming from his room, even though Alex was sound asleep. Toys would move on their own, arranged in neat circles, as if after a play session. We dismissed it as sleepwalking or Alex playing after we'd put him to bed. But one night, everything changed, and our skepticism turned into fear. It was past midnight, and both my wife and I were awakened by the sound of Alex talking in his sleep, something about playing more tomorrow. We listened, amused at first, until we heard another voice whisper back. It was faint, barely audible, but it was definitely not our son's voice. A cold dread settled over us as we sat up in bed, straining our ears against the darkness. The conversation stopped and a heavy silence hung over the house. Just as we began to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination, the door to Alex's room creaked open slowly. The faint glow from his nightlight spilled into the hallway, casting long shadows. My heart pounded as I got out of bed, determined to protect my family from whatever or whoever was in our house. Creeping towards Alex's room, the temperature dropped sharply. The air felt charged, static. As I reached for the door, it swung open fully, and a small, dark shadow darted out, turning back towards the closet as if taunting me to follow. My wife clutched my arm, her face pale with fear. I lunged forward, flinging the closet door open, ready to confront an intruder. But there was nothing, just the empty closet with Alex's clothes swinging gently from their hangers. The shadow appeared again at the threshold of the closet, stepped forward into the room, and then retreated back into the closet. It did this repeatedly, as if stuck in a loop. After several terrifying minutes, the shadow vanished, and the room felt normal again. The chill dissipated, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted as suddenly as it had descended. We checked on Alex, who, throughout the entire ordeal, had slept peacefully, unaware of the night's events. The next morning, we searched the house for any sign of intrusion, but everything was as it should be. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing out of place except for the lingering unease that clung to us. We debated what to do, considered moving out, but rationality overtook our initial fear. We decided to stay, hoping it was just a one-off occurrence. But it wasn't. Each night, the same scenario would unfold with the shadow playing its eerie game. We consulted with paranormal experts, held sessions with mediums, tried cleansing rituals, but nothing stopped the nightly visits. Then, just as suddenly as they began, the visits stopped. One night, the shadow didn't appear, and the house remained quiet. Nights passed into weeks, and the shadow never returned. The tension in the house eased, and slowly, our life returned to normal. Alex never mentioned Charlie again. To this day, we don't know what Charlie was or why it stopped visiting. Maybe it moved on, maybe it found what it was looking for, or maybe it's still there, watching, waiting. But for now, we enjoy the peace, always mindful of the thin veil between our world and whatever lies just beyond, in the shadows. Job as a night security guard at the St. Augustine Lighthouse, I was just looking for a way to make some extra money. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I thought the stories about the lighthouse being haunted were just local lore meant to scare tourists. My first shift started uneventfully enough with a tour of the grounds and a rundown of my responsibilities. Little did I know, that night would change my life forever. The lighthouse itself is an imposing structure, standing tall against the dark sky, its light sweeping methodically over the restless ocean. The history is rich, with its roots stretching back to the Spanish colonial era. The new tower was built in the 1870s, and that's where the hauntings are said to originate, tied to the tragic death of 3 young girls who drowned when a construction cart they were playing in broke loose and plunged into the water. I settled into the small office inside the keeper's house, flipping through some old newspapers I found in a drawer. The hours passed slowly. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk around the grounds. The air was thick with humidity, typical for a summer night in Florida. The moonlight cast eerie shadows, but I pushed the creepy atmosphere to the back of my mind. The first odd thing I noticed was the sound of footsteps echoing on the gravel path behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see a late-night visitor, or maybe a stray animal, but there was nothing. Just the empty path illuminated by the lighthouse's beam. I shrugged it off and continued my rounds. As I approached the lighthouse tower, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The door to the tower was slightly ajar, which was strange since I was sure I had locked it earlier. Pushing it open, I stepped inside and started up the spiral staircase. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, a rhythmic pounding that matched my heartbeat. Halfway up, the light from my flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. I cursed under my breath and fumbled with the switch, but it was dead. The only light came from the distant beam of the lighthouse itself, casting intermittent glows through the narrow windows. I continued upward, using the dim light to guide me. Reaching the top, I stepped out onto the observation deck. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of the Atlantic stretching out before me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving across the deck, just at the edge of my vision. It was quick, disappearing behind the tower before I could get a good look. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just my imagination running wild. But as I turned to head back down, I saw it again, this time more clearly. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing at the opposite end of the deck. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding braver than I felt. There was no response. I took a step closer, but the figure remained still. I reached for my radio, intending to call my supervisor, but the device was dead, just like my flashlight. A sudden gust of wind slammed the observation deck door shut, the noise startling me. I spun around, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I hurried back down the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity, the shadows seeming to close in around me. Back on the ground, I headed straight for the office, locking the door behind me. I needed to collect my thoughts, to make sense of what I'd seen. Sitting at the desk, I noticed something strange on the monitor, displaying the security camera feeds. The camera pointed at the base of the lighthouse showed the shadowy figure again, standing motionless by the door. It was impossible, no one could have gotten there that quickly. I watched, transfixed, as the figure slowly turned and seemed to look directly into the camera. Even though the image was grainy, I felt its gaze pierce through the screen. A cold, unnerving sensation that made my skin crawl. The figure moved again, disappearing from view. I switched through the camera feeds frantically, trying to locate it, but it was gone. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety, every creak and groan of the old building sending me into a state of high alert. When morning finally came, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't explain what I had seen, and I wasn't willing to stick around and find out more. To this day, I avoid the St. Augustine Lighthouse, steering clear of its imposing silhouette against the horizon. I no longer scoff at ghost stories because I know some of them are true. The lighthouse remains a beacon, not just for ships, but for something far more sinister lurking in the shadows. Night hiking is unlike anything else. There's something about the being alone with nature at night that really reconnects you to a different part of something primal. That all changed one night in early October. I had ventured into the dense forest near an old abandoned cabin that locals avoided. The cabin was rumored to be haunted, but I never believed in such things. To me, it was just another spot to explore. The moon was full, casting an eerie light through the trees. I made my way along the familiar trail, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the fallen leaves. As I approached the cabin, I noticed a figure standing in the clearing ahead. It was dark and still, almost blending into the shadows. I stopped, trying to make out who or what it was, but the figure didn't move. I called out, but there was no response. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me. I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Ignoring my instincts to turn back, I walked closer. As I got within a few feet of the figure, it vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Continuing past the cabin, I decided to take a different route back, hoping to shake off the unsettling feeling. But the forest seemed different, the trees more twisted, and the path unfamiliar. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my unease growing with each step. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling noise behind me. I turned, expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing. The noise came again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace, but the sound followed. I broke into a run, the forest a blur around me. Suddenly I tripped over a root and fell, hitting the ground hard. Gasping for breath, I looked up, expecting to see the figure standing over me. But there was nothing. The forest was silent, the only sound my ragged breathing. I got to my feet, my body aching, and started walking again. Slower this time, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I got in and locked the doors, taking a moment to catch my breath. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the forest watching me. I didn't stop until I was miles away. That night I had a vivid dream. I was back in the forest, but everything was twisted and wrong. The trees were dead, and the ground was covered in a thick, unnatural fog. The figure was there, moving silently among the trees, always just out of sight. I felt its eyes on me, cold and unfeeling. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The feeling of being watched lingered, even in the safety of my home. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I haven't been back to that forest since. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that the figure is still out there, waiting. Now, whenever I hear stories of haunted places, I listen, because I know that sometimes the things we don't believe in are real, and they're watching, waiting for us to wander too close. I took a job as a nurse at a brand new hospital that had been built on the site of an old abandoned psychiatric facility. The new building was state-of-the-art, with all the latest medical equipment and technology. But there were rumors among the staff that the land itself was cursed, haunted by the spirits of the patients who had suffered there. The old hospital had been closed for decades, its decaying structure finally demolished to make way for the new facility. I had always been skeptical of ghost stories, so I brushed off the warnings and focused on my work. But soon, strange things began to happen. One night I was working the late shift when I heard faint whispers echoing through the empty hallways. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the whispers grew louder and more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the basement, which housed the morgue and storage rooms. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. As I descended the stairs, the temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding. The whispers became clearer, and I could make out words and phrases. "Help us," they said. "Find us." I reached the basement and saw a dim light flickering in one of the storage rooms. As I approached, I felt a cold breeze and heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a shiver of fear. In the storage room, I found an old, dusty file cabinet. The light was coming from a small, flickering bulb above it. I opened the cabinet and discovered a collection of old patient files from the psychiatric hospital. The files were filled with notes about treatments, medications, and the tragic stories of the patients who had lived and died there. One file caught my eye. It was for a patient named Margaret, a nurse who had worked at the old hospital before becoming a patient herself. The notes detailed her descent into madness and her eventual death. The whispers grew louder as I read, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her face pale and expressionless. She stared at me for a moment before whispering, "Help us." Then she vanished, leaving me alone in the cold, dark room. Determined to find out more, I researched Margaret's history and discovered that she had been a dedicated nurse who had cared deeply for her patients. She had uncovered evidence of abuse and mistreatment at the hospital. But before she could expose it, she was committed as a patient and eventually died under mysterious circumstances. I realized that Margaret's spirit, and possibly others, were trapped in the new hospital, unable to move on because of the injustices they had suffered. I tried to share my findings with my colleagues, but they dismissed it as superstition. The strange occurrences continued. I would see Margaret's figure in the hallways, hear her whispers in the quiet moments of the night, and feel her presence in the empty rooms. It became a nightly routine, and I began to expect her appearances. But Margaret's spirit wasn't seeking closure or remembrance. She wanted to be seen, to make her presence known, and to instill fear. Her appearances grew more terrifying. I would catch glimpses of her in reflective surfaces, her face twisted in a sinister grin. Objects would move on their own, and lights would flicker violently. One night I was alone in the basement again when the power went out. In the pitch darkness, I heard Margaret's voice, clear and menacing. "I see you," she whispered. I felt a cold hand brush against my neck, and I ran out of the basement, my heart racing. The next day I asked to be transferred to a different shift. I couldn't take the night shifts anymore, knowing Margaret was lurking, waiting to terrify anyone who dared to see her. Even now, working during the day, I sometimes feel her eyes on me, reminding me that she's still there, still watching, and still wanting to be seen. As the new night watchman at a local cemetery, I expected the job to be quiet and uneventful. The cemetery was old, with towering oak trees and weathered tombstones that dated back to the 1800s. It had an eerie beauty, especially under the moonlight. The job was simple. Walk the grounds, ensure there were no vandals or trespassers, and keep an eye on things until dawn. The first few nights were uneventful, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. Then, one night, I saw it. A shapeless figure, darker than the surrounding night, moving swiftly between the trees. It was fast and silent, almost as if it were floating. I blinked, and it was gone. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and continued my rounds. But the figure kept appearing. Each night I would catch glimpses of it moving between the trees, always just out of reach. It never made a sound, but I could sense its presence, feel its gaze on me. The figure seemed to watch me, studying my every move. It was always the same. A quick, shadowy form that vanished as soon as I tried to get a closer look. One night, as I walked the perimeter of the cemetery, I saw the figure again. This time, it was moving faster, darting from tree to tree, getting closer with each movement. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. The figure continued to move, its pace quickening. It was now close enough that I could make out its shape. A tall, dark shadow, vaguely human, but without any distinct features. It seemed to glide rather than walk, and it never made a sound. As it moved, a foul odor filled the air, like old roadkill left in the hot sun. The smell was nauseating, and I had to cover my nose and mouth to keep from gagging. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks on me. But the figure kept getting closer, its movements becoming more erratic. It was no longer just watching me, it was stalking me. The smell grew stronger and the air felt thick and oppressive. My heart raced, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I decided I had had enough. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the silent cemetery. I didn't stop until I was out of the gates and back in my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath and calm down. I looked back at the cemetery, half expecting to see the figure standing at the gates. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the night and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next day, but he dismissed it as a product of my imagination. He assured me that there were no reports of hauntings or strange occurrences at the cemetery. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The following night, I returned to the cemetery, determined to face whatever it was that had been stalking me. I walked the grounds, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The figure didn't appear, and I began to think that maybe it had just been my imagination after all. But then I smelled it again, the foul odor. I turned, and there it was, standing just a few feet away. The shadowy figure, watching me with its featureless face. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment I was frozen with fear. I forced myself to move, slowly backing away from the figure. It didn't follow me this time. It just stood there, watching as I retreated. I made my way back to the car, the smell lingering in the air. I never saw the figure again after that night, but the experience left me with a deep sense of unease. The cemetery was no longer a place of quiet beauty. It had become a place of fear and dread. I eventually quit the job, unable to shake the feeling dark entities were lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. When my wife and I moved into our new house, it felt like a fresh start. The place was perfect, a 2-story Victorian with plenty of room for our growing family. It sat on a quiet street lined with old trees, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough. We settled in quickly, unpacking and making the house our own. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. Each night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I would see a man standing at the window across the street. His house was dark, the curtains drawn, but there he was, staring out into the night. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor with an unusual habit. But night after night, he was there, always in the same spot, always watching. I mentioned it to my wife, but she laughed it off, saying I was just being paranoid. She hadn't seen him, and she thought it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man never moved, never blinked. It was as if he were a statue or a ghost. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to get a closer look. I slipped out of bed and crept across the street, keeping to the shadows. As I approached the house, my heart pounded in my chest. I felt a mix of excitement and dread, wondering what I would find. The front yard was overgrown, the grass tall and unkempt. The house itself looked abandoned, the paint peeling and the windows dusty. I reached the front door and, finding it unlocked, pushed it open. The door creaked on its hinges and I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was just as neglected as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. I made my way through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. There was no sign of life, no indication that anyone had lived there for years. I climbed the stairs, my heart in my throat. I reached the second floor and found the room with the window where I had seen the man. The room was empty, just like the rest of the house. But as I approached the window, I felt a chill. There, on the floor, were footprints in the dust, leading to the window and back again. I turned to leave, my skin crawling. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a noise behind me. A soft, shuffling sound. I turned, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there. I hurried down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until I was back in my own home, the door locked behind me. I didn't tell my wife about what I had found. I didn't want to worry her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that wasn't entirely human. The man in the window haunted my thoughts, and I found myself avoiding looking out at night, afraid of what I might see. A few weeks later, we had a neighborhood block party. It was a chance to meet the neighbors and get to know the community. As we mingled, I overheard a conversation about the house across the street. I joined in, curious to see if anyone knew anything about the man I had seen. One of the older neighbors, a woman named Mrs. Thompson, told me that the house had been abandoned for years. The previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances, and no one had lived there since. She mentioned that there were rumors of the house being haunted, but she dismissed them as silly superstitions. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The man in the window, the footprints in the dust, the stories of hauntings. It all added up to something I couldn't explain. I felt a presence in the room, a weight on my chest as if something were pressing down on me. I finally drifted off to sleep, only to be woken by a loud crash. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw that the window had shattered. Shards of glass littered the floor, and the curtains billowed in the wind. I rushed to the window and looked out, but there was no sign of anyone. The next morning, I found a note on our front porch. It was written by a shaky hand, the words barely legible. "Leave now," it said. "You're not safe here." It was probably just the neighbors' kids that had overheard the conversation, but it was enough to creep me out given the circumstances. Police weren't able to find out who had thrown it, so I ate the cost of the window. I still feel like I'm being watched and do my best to just ignore it. I was hired as the Night Watchman for an abandoned psychiatric hospital. The building had been shut down for years, and my job was to ensure no one broke in. The first thing the owner told me was that the lights had to stay off to avoid driving up the utility bill. It made sense, but it also made the job more unnerving. After a few uneventful nights, I started noticing strange things. Doors would be open that I knew I had closed, and I would hear distant footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I brushed it off as my imagination, but the occurrences became more frequent and more disturbing. One night, while making my rounds, I saw a figure at the end of a hallway. It was tall and moved quickly out of sight. I rushed to the spot but found nothing. This happened several times over the next few nights. Each time, the figure would disappear before I could get a good look. Convinced that someone was sneaking in, I requested a budget from the owner to install a camera system. He agreed, and within a week, I had set up cameras covering all the main areas, including the hallway where I had seen the figure. The first few nights with the cameras were quiet. Then one night I saw the figure again. It moved down the hallway, and I quickly checked the camera feed. To my shock, the camera showed me chasing and speaking to thin air. There was no figure on the footage, it was just me, running down an empty hallway. Confused and scared, I reviewed the recordings from previous nights. Each time I had seen the figure, the camera showed nothing but me, alone and seemingly talking to myself. The figure's presence, however, was real to me. I could feel its eyes on me, sense its frantic movements. One night, while checking the cameras, I saw something new. In the footage, I noticed that my eyes would dart to empty corners as if tracking something invisible. I replayed the clips over and over, trying to make sense of it. The final straw came when I was making my rounds and the figure appeared right in front of me. Its eyes bore into mine, filled with an unholy intensity. It whispered something I couldn't understand, and then it was gone. I ran back to the security room and checked the footage. Again, it showed nothing but me, staring into the empty air, speaking to no one. I realized then that whatever I was dealing with wasn't human. It was a spirit or an entity that only I could see. The more I interacted with it, the more real it seemed to become. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I reported everything to the owner and handed in my resignation. The last thing I saw on the camera feed before I left was myself, standing alone in the hallway, looking lost and terrified. The figure never showed itself on the footage, but I knew it was still there, lurking in the shadows. As I walked out of the hospital for the last time, I felt a heavy weight lift from my shoulders. But the memory of the crazed, frantic eyes stayed with me, a reminder that some places are haunted by more than just memories. They are haunted by the echoes of the past and by spirits that refuse to rest. I had been working as a night security guard at an old cathedral for a few months when the strange occurrences began. The cathedral, built in the 1800s, was a massive stone structure with towering spires and intricate stained glass windows. It was beautiful by day, but at night it took on a more sinister atmosphere. One night during my usual rounds, I heard a faint melodic humming coming from the main hall. Curious, I followed the sound, which grew louder as I approached the grand entrance. The hall was empty, but the humming continued, echoing off the high ceilings and stone walls. I stood there, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The next night, the humming returned, but this time it was accompanied by a soft, eerie chanting. It sounded like a choir, but I was the only one in the cathedral. I felt a cold breeze, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. The chanting grew louder, and I could make out words in Latin, though I couldn't understand their meaning. Determined to find the source, I checked every room, every nook and cranny of the cathedral, but found nothing. The chanting stopped as soon as I entered a room, only to resume once I left. It was as if the sound was toying with me, leading me in circles. I decided to record the sounds, hoping to analyze them later. The next night, armed with a digital recorder, I waited in the main hall. The chanting began again, filling the vast space with its haunting melody. I recorded for hours, capturing every note, every eerie whisper. The following day, I played back the recording. At first, it was just the chanting, clear and melodic. But then, beneath the surface, I heard something else. A low, guttural voice, barely audible. It sent a shiver through me. I played it again, straining to make out the words. It sounded like a warning, a plea for help. I researched the cathedral's history and discovered that it had been built on the site of an older church that had burned down in the 1700s. Many people had died in the fire, including a choir that was rehearsing inside. Their bodies were never recovered, and the site had been consecrated and rebuilt. I began to wonder if the spirits of the choir were trapped, trying to communicate. That night, I returned to the cathedral, determined to make contact. As soon as the chanting started, I spoke aloud, asking who they were and what they wanted. The chanting paused, and the cathedral fell silent. Then a single voice spoke, clear and sorrowful. "Release us," it said. The temperature dropped, and I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw faint, ghostly figures standing in the shadows. They were watching me, waiting. I asked how I could help, and the voice responded, "Find our remains." I realized that the bodies of the choir members must still be somewhere within the cathedral's grounds. The next day, I contacted a local historian and shared my findings. Together, we searched the cathedral and its surroundings. In the crypt beneath the cathedral, we found a hidden chamber, sealed off and forgotten. Inside were the charred remains of the choir, buried in the rubble of the old church. We arranged for a proper burial, and a ceremony was held to honor their memory. That night, the cathedral was silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the air felt lighter, almost peaceful. The haunting chants were gone, and the spirits of the choir had finally found peace. Though I still work at the cathedral, I no longer fear the night. Curious for more creepy tales? Don't just listen to the shadows, join our community of the brave and the bold. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and ring the bell to never miss out on our allegedly true scary stories. Have your own ghostly encounters, sinister sightings, or otherwise scary event? Drop us a comment below. We're dying to hear from you.